very warm welcome to the first public edition of our new series, Leaders for Humanity. And I'm extremely, extremely pleased to have with us a very, very special guest today who definitely requires no introduction, a rebel with a cause for all his life, a management icon, and still very, very keen to help and make management better. Henry Mintzberg, very warm welcome to the show.
Thank you. Delightful to be here. This is going to be fun.
Great, great pleasure. And I have to say, and sorry, Mike Porter, I remember being at my undergrad studies where everybody was rallying around the emergent strategy and was trying to get away from strategic planning. So I'm sure that will be a little bit of an undertone in the session today. But
okay, where was that, by the way? Where was that?
In Bologna.
Okay, good, good.
And before we go into the depth of the discussion, though, I want to briefly, as always, position the agenda. So what are we going to do? Firstly, we're going to quickly look at the Good Organizations project with my co-host Antoinette, and welcome to Antoinette. I'm always forgetting. Antoinette and I launched about 4 months ago. And then we will look at introducing Henry properly. And then we will go into the dialogue about good organizations, but today with a special title and a special investigation, which is all about Henry's new work of Rebalancing Society. So we'll talk about the urgent case for Rebalancing Society, and in a, I hope, a little bit of a Henry style undertone that hoping for the best is certainly not a strategy. So that will keep us busy for the next hour and a half. And with that, let me present you the program. So the Good Organizations project is an inquiry into how organizations can play a responsible role in this ever increasingly complex and ever-changing time. How can organizations become a responsible actor within society and ensure that collectively they're helping to make the world better? How can they become a container for the communities that are within the organizations or in contact with the organization? And finally, how can they become breeding grounds and enablers for individuals to attain a good life through work or with work as well? And in this inquiry, which we believe is very urgent in these times, where still a lot of suffering is present in organizations of all kinds, and I'm sure Henry's going to talk about that, we're trying to rally some free thinkers who have ideas about alternative ways to deal or to bring organizations to life. We are working with researchers to bring some evidence to some of the questions or proposals that we are capturing. And we are seeking guidance from people that have brought together academia, research, consulting, and actual practice. And of course, Henry qualifies on all those accounts. So very, very happy to have you with us, Henry. And with that, I would suggest a proper introduction is due. And with that, over to you, Antoinette.
Yes, it's my pleasure. Because Henry, I have to tell you that I was, of course, studying, among other things, organization, and you were the Illuminati of the organization design researchers at that time, and probably still are, in my opinion. So great to have you with us. And looking through your CV, it's of course, wow, I can only say, as a fellow scholar, very far apart, because you are officer of the Order of Canada, elected fellow in so many reputed societies, 21 honorary degrees. I've seldom seen that. And I have to mention 2 are from Switzerland, just 1 from the UK, Otti. So maybe the UK has to make up a little bit. And of course, writer of various books, articles on many topics we hopefully go to cover. If I can say a little bit more from how you also introduce yourself, and we already talked about that, I have to say I find it great that you're such an accomplished sportsman as well, because you told us that you were cycling in the steep Swiss mountains. And of course, we can see you in your canoe in several of your books. So wow. You're a wordsmith and a dedicated writer, and I think we are going to realize your word crafting during the interview as well. And I think you made us, and I mean the whole academic and hopefully also practice community, rethink stuff ever and ever again. And with stuff, I mean, certainly the fall of strategic planning, Otti has already mentioned, the manager-leader separation trap, a few of the colleagues are still doing. And here you famously said, we are overled, but undermanaged, still like that. And the rise of corporate irresponsibility. And that is something we are surely going to cover. So I'm sure I haven't nearly covered all what you're doing, but I hope when we're going a little bit further, we come closer to that. And of course, I want to give you also the opportunity to say a little bit more about yourself. And my first question here would be, what would you say were the main adventures in your own life or work that have influenced your thinking?
You know, I was thinking about that because you sent me the questions ahead of time, and I was thinking about a number of the questions. You know, I don't see my life as kind of steps or kind of major points of inflection. I see my life as a kind of steady evolution, starting with where I am, not so different, but becoming more and more firm about my convictions. So I think things reinforced what I did rather than any epiphany. You know, professionally, I had a bit of a debate with Herbert Simon, who to me was the most important management organization writer of all time. And we totally disagreed about something, and he knew more about it than I did. And it almost caused me to stop publishing an article that he said was wrong. And I thought, either I'm wrong or he's biased. And I decided that he was biased. And I think that was proved right. It's all written up in a book. All the correspondences, with his permission, is in a book called Mintzberg on Management. But I think it was the reinforcement of ideas that seemed outliers and kind of, you know, far out, that proved to be not so far out. So now I go around saying that when I say something is outrageous, it may become obvious. And I've had a terrible time during the pandemic, but not like anybody else. I've had a personally secure time, but a terrible time trying to make a point in the pandemic about the role of pollution. And now, 15 months later, it's coming out exactly as I predicted it in April. I didn't predict it, I claimed it in April of 2020. Could never get through. And now, and along the way said, I must be wrong. Nobody wants to, none of the newspapers, nobody wants to touch this. And now it's coming out. So it kind of reinforces my personal determination. I think that's kind of the way things have been. So there have been events along the way for sure. But they're steps along the same trajectory, I think.
But Henry, I want to end on this occasion. I want to make a call out to Phil Lanier. There's not only your son-in-law, but also the CEO of Coaching Ourselves, who has brought us all together. And I think talking about coaching ourselves and also Rebalancing Society, is there not more of an active societal role that you're stepping into? And I was wondering, thinking back about your management roles that you once defined, 10 management roles, what type of role are you stepping into now, if you look at your own paradigm?
Well, I think now was 1991 when I started on this trajectory, visiting Prague, and maybe we'll get to that later. But I certainly did a major shift from just management issues to more broader societal issues. And even my publisher, who've been terrific all along, some of the people in the publisher said, don't touch this book, Rebalancing Society, because he's a management guy. And in a sense, they were right, because it took a long time for that book to gain some traction. What am I doing writing a management, a societal book, a political economic book when I'm a management guy? But of course, I started as a sports reporter for the McGill Daily newspaper at the university. And what the heck was I doing writing about sports when I wasn't playing football or hockey? So what was I doing writing about sports? What was I doing writing about management? I'm not a manager. So what am I doing writing about politics or the future of society when I'm not a political scientist? But you know what? Everybody's in their box. And they had me, people have me in my box. You're a management guy. What are you doing wasting our time on this other stuff? And it's been grueling in some respects. Like, what the heck do I really know about pollution? At the beginning of this, I thought an aerosol was something used to spray in the house, to clean the air. That's what I thought an aerosol was, compared to a little tiny particle of COVID or carrying COVID. So I've kind of made a career. It's kind of characteristic of MBAs that they shoot their mouths off about all kinds of things, right? That they don't really understand. And I don't technically have an MBA, but in effect, I have a Master of Science, which is like an MBA. So why not go big? I don't mean this kind of the way it sounds, but if Picasso could have his blue period, then why can't I have my megalomaniacal period with Rebalancing Society,
Although you have already analyzed why this is happening, because professional bureaucracies tend to categorize people. Didn't you write that yourself? I think so. And the other thing, I believe in your horseshoe, you already were clearly going towards that direction, but I might be wrong. So I would kind of see your progressing history from the outside. But there's a last thing.
Antoine, let me just say something. The professional bureaucracy, when I write about the forms of organizations, I maintain that I'm most comfortable in a professional bureaucracy, namely university, because it gives me complete authority. Basically, I work for myself and get a regular paycheck. But my heart is kind of with adhocracy, with creativity and openness and project organizations and trying things. And, and I've had some pretty glamorous failures, mostly in trying to execute some of the things I've been writing about. So Karl Marx learned how to ride a horse, it's claimed, so that he could lead the revolution. I haven't learned how to touch type, so I can't lead the revolution. But I have a thick skin, so I can take a lot of criticism and a lot of failure. The piece I wrote on the pandemic, an op-ed piece of about 1,000 words. There were different versions. I counted it up. I did 150 versions, and the only person who would publish any of them, aside from a couple of small blogs, was my own blog. So I vanity published this stuff, and maybe someday somebody will go back and say, "Oh my God, he got it right after all." But mostly the opinion I got was, "What are you wasting your time writing about pollution and the pandemic? You're an expert in neither."
But there, I think we already see that that was the right thing to do. I just want to ask you one thing more, because you even showed it to us a little bit. But what is it with your beaver collection? Is that your good life, or?
It is my good life in the sense that I have enormous pride, maybe even more than my books. I'm not sure about that, but I love my beaver. You can see them over my shoulder here, a few of them. Many are much bigger. They're all over the house. We went on a canoe trip years ago, and we actually flew in a plane with the canoe on the pontoon, and they dropped us, and that was it. We had the canoe out for 3 days, and I saw this piece of wood floating in the water, and I picked it up, and I loved the shape and look of it. I just love the look of it. It's not like driftwood, it's worked wood. A friend of mine says this isn't art, so I say, okay, it's craft. It's worked wood, but I carried it out, which meant every portage we had to carry this piece of wood. It wasn't that heavy. And then I started collecting them wherever I could. I kind of love the form of them. I love the shape of them. Anybody can see them on mintzberg.org/beaver. You can see a whole bunch of them.
I love that.
And the lake I'm on now, where we have our home, is on a lake called Lac Castor, Beaver Lake, in the Laurentian Mountains in Quebec. So we're surrounded by beavers. We take the canoe over a beaver dam onto a back lake, and so on. So there's
Very nice.
something, and you know, they're the national symbol of Canada animal symbol because of the construction. You know, we build dams and big projects in this country, and that's what beavers do, and they're quite remarkable. So
maybe you said part of your good life. Maybe there's a little bit of a beaver in you, going on and crafting and shaping. So let's see what we can craft together. I want to go.
Let me just say that I don't know if I was a beaver in my last life, but I think I might have been a beaver dam, if not a glacier. So, and I do want to say that I'm trained as an engineer. Although beavers are civil engineers, and that's an oxymoron. I never met a civil engineer, but beavers are civil engineers.
I have a suspicion that the beaver metaphor will accompany us throughout some of the other questions that we have. Let's see how many times we get back to beavers tonight. So I will briefly flip up one slide, which always frames our inquiry, just again to a little bit construct the container. So as I said earlier, and here just visually, we're looking at good business in the good society. And today we will focus more on the good society. Then we look at how to build good organizations. And Henry already spoke about archetypes of organizations and the fact that I think Henry is refreshing the famous book on structure and organizations. So we'll talk about that. And finally, we will talk about leadership and transformation. And again, I'm very curious in the context of the case for the rebalancing of society, what your latest thoughts are, Henry, in terms of how can we get there? What steps can we all take? And I think you call the first the John question, and the second, which I always forget, is
the Irene question.
The Irene question. So we will also lift the magic and mystery of the John and the Irene question. But I will take this back. I want to start with something else, because I guess there are some people out there listening to us who have never heard about Rebalancing Society and who might not even think that we've got a problem. And by the way, for everybody who wants to read the book, it's freely available on Henry's website. So please have a look. And of course, we will share the links afterwards. But Henry, I want to warm us all up a little bit. And I think the rebellious spirit that you have is coming through also in the appendix of your book. And you're sharing an essay, which is called Boiling in Our Own Water. And of course, referring to those frogs that in a slowly increasing temperature in the water don't jump out of the water and eventually die. And there's some interesting symptoms that you're describing. So I want to just get your views on a few of those symptoms tonight to start us up and to really give people an understanding as to why we actually have a problem. And the first one that you state is consumed by consumption. Yeah. What is behind that?
Okay, let me just give a bit of background. The story, of course, is the famous story of the frog, that if you put it in boiling water, it'll jump out. But if you put it in cold water and bring it to a boil, it'll stay and become frog's legs, I guess. I think that's what's happened to us. It's crept up on us. The imbalance in society has crept up on us. And the imbalance I refer to is I don't know if you want to get into it now, but essentially there are three sectors in society, not two: public, private, and what I call plural. And we'll come back to that, I guess, but plural means community. Public means government, private means markets, and so on. And healthy societies balance those. The communist regimes in Eastern Europe didn't collapse because capitalism beat communism. it was because the communist countries were out of balance on the side of government. And because we believe that capitalism trounced communism, we've been going out of balance ever since on the side of private markets and independence. I'm a great fan of business and private enterprise, but not out of its place. Its place is the marketplace, not in politics, not in government. And maybe we'll come back to that. But I see these problems, like consumed by consumption, as originating, or at least being exacerbated by the power of the private sector. So, for example, if we want to get rid of carbon energy, this is obvious, but there are a lot of interests that don't want to get rid of carbon energy. They make a lot of money out of carbon energy, or we like our cars the way they are, thank you. Don't bother me with an electric car right now. And we're being driven to consume more and more, which means to waste more and more, which means to burn more and more, create more and more pollution, and so on and so forth. And I can track the pandemic partly to that, because pollution is playing a role in the pandemic as soon as people wake up and realize it. And there are some articles that support that now. So income disparities are obviously a function of the imbalance between the private sector and the public and plural or community sectors. So a number of these things relate to that kind of imbalance. And it's kind of crept up on us. It didn't start in 1989 with the collapse of the Berlin Wall, but it certainly accelerated since 1989. But it's been with us for a long time. And I always had this point of view that business is just too powerful. I remember years ago looking at all the departments of the Canadian government and saying, God, they're all economic. All the ones that are important are economic. The ones that are social are far fewer and far less influential. So we've been living with that imbalance forever. It's just that it's gotten completely out of control now. Maybe to mention one other thing, and the link, I'm working on another article that I can't publish, or so far, with two different titles, but they're the same. Can the pandemic stop? Can the pandemic stop the? Can the pollution stop the pandemic? No. Wait a minute. Can pollution? Anyway, the point is, can what we learned from the pandemic enable us to stop the imbalance? That's essentially what I'm saying. Because what we learned from the pandemic is that we're prepared to make unbelievable changes, inconceivable changes in no time. Imagine if somebody said to you in 2019, we're going to close down our economies completely and we're going to lock you up for months at a time. You'd think the person was a lunatic. But we did it. And the reason we did it was because we were scared. Well, why aren't we as scared about climate change? It's going to be far worse. Why aren't we as scared about influenza? Because influenza every year kills almost twice as many people as the pandemic has killed. Every year in the case of influenza. So the one thing we can learn from the pandemic is we can make these changes. And frankly, climate change doesn't require nearly the drastic measures that what we did with the pollution. Climate change doesn't require that we close our economies and lock us up. It does require that we change our behaviors about consumption. It does require that we close down particularly polluting activities. It does require that. So I'm trying to make that point. And that's sort of how it all kind of comes together. I'm sure we can find a connection with professional organizations too.
I will, let's see. I hope so, because that is certainly one of the aspects of our inquiry. But I want to, and thank you for framing it even more widely, because I think it's important people understand what your current thinking is. We will go there again, and I want to throw in two quotes, which I really liked. Creeping up, you said, on us. You said something, the economy of free enterprises becomes a society. When the economy of free enterprises becomes a society of free enterprise, a corporate society, its citizens are no longer free. I thought it was a very interesting suggestion. You also said we are driving to compete, collect, and consume our way to neurotic oblivion. I have to say, I love that quote. And you suggested the fall of communism, 89, was the end of thinking, potentially, unless we wake up. And I think your book starts with exactly that. Enough of the imbalance that is destroying our democracies, our planet, and ourselves. And I think this is a very good warm-up, so to speak. I want to ask you about maybe 2 or 3 more of these symptoms, because I love the way that you frame them. The second one, corporate person and human resource.
Yeah. Okay, let me say a couple of things before I get to that. You know, people collect different things. I collect beaver sculptures, but I also collect adjectival capitalism phrases. I've got over 10. I think I found the 11th one. 11 different phrases for fixing capitalism, caring capitalism, progressive capitalism. It just goes on and on. My favorite is democratic capitalism. Notice that capitalism is the noun and democracy is the adjective. That's the order is quite clear. So to quote, who was it? Was it, I think it's in My Fair Lady, methinks that capitalism doth propose too much. You know, there's 11 different forms. We don't need to fix capitalism. Of course we do. Sorry. We need to fix capitalism. But we're never going to fix capitalism if we don't fix society. Capitalism is run rampant in society, and nowhere is there better exhibited than phrases like democratic capitalism. People don't even think about what they're saying, which is that capitalism is more important than democracy.
Well, and I think you're saying in your book, you're saying, how is it that the word that initially was used in a pejorative fashion by Marx and others, which describes a way that funds our enterprises, has become the vision of mankind? Well, it's quite funny.
Yeah, but it was also used in a neutral fashion. It was a way to fund enterprise. Yeah, that's good. Why not? Capital, you fund enterprise with capital. So that's fine, but how it became the be-all and end-all of our existence is another of those things that's crept up where we can't even... I'm having an argument with somebody. They're doing a book of readings of different points of view on sort of rethinking capitalism. And I said, you know, my piece should have been in there. And they put my piece in there. And 2 years later, they dropped it out. And I said, you know, it was easy to throw mine out because every other piece in the book is about how you fix capitalism. And the one piece that says it's not about fixing capitalism, it's about fixing society, for heaven's sake, sort of gets dropped. Okay, so
corporate person, because I think you connect that with the disease and human resource.
I mean, that's part of the vocabulary. That's all part. We're human resources. We're human capital. We're human assets. This economics run wild. You know, economics is one aspect of our existence, but we're also social and we're also political. And this idea that we're human resources. I'm not a human resource. I'm a human being. You know, this is a resource. You know, this is a resource. You know, or this. You know, this comes out of the well. This is a resource. I'm not a resource. I am a person. But then we have corporate persons, and corporate persons, after all, you know, it's a one-sided corporate person, because in the United States, corporate persons have certain rights in law as persons, but they never go to jail. Now, if Pfizer does something that's really bad, as it's done from time to time, maybe not during the pandemic, but earlier, as it's done from time to time, Pfizer should go to jail if it wants to be a person. Now, what does it mean to go to jail? It means they shouldn't be able to function for the period that they're in jail. Close down Pfizer for 1 or 2 years in return for criminal activity. Well, Pfizer would never accept that. And if they won't accept that, then why should they be persons? They're not persons. It's a farce. So,
but I think you're recommending, Henry, I think you're recommending, if you want to go do a crime and not go to jail, wear white collar.
Yes, exactly. If you want, yeah, exactly. If you're going to commit a crime, commit a white collar crime, because you'll get away with it. Don't commit a blue-collar crime. Don't steal a television set, but cheat your banking clients. That's okay.
I've got two more.
From there, you have two more. I was kind of thinking.
I've got two more because Henry's warming up and I'm loving it. So, Henry, I'll give you two more because I think in your book, and everybody, please read the book. I think at some stage you're saying this was a good rant, but it's not a rant against business. It's a rant against the unbalancing. So I think we are doing a rant here against the unbalancing, but I want to get people into the spirit of the book, and who could do that better? So Henry, I've got two more for you. And now I need to choose because I know Antoinette wants to move us on. So I'll choose lies the lobbyists tell us, and then I choose democracy in America 25 years later. So the lobbyists, and what about democracy 25 years after the victorious white knights of capitalism have taken it all and are living happily forever after?
Well, just open the New York Times op-ed page, opinion page, they call it now, I guess, and read all the articles about how democracy is failing in the United States with the Republican Party going nuts. And yet never a word about the culprit. Never a word about the culprit. I probably sent them 20 different pieces on the culprit. I had a whole series called Donald Trump is not the problem, Imbalance is the problem. And I couldn't get them to publish any of it. At least I got the ear of one editor who listened for a while and then said, well, we can't really do it. But since then, they don't respond. Anyway.
And you got some great statistics there, by the way, in terms of incarceration rates, in terms of illiteracy rates, in terms of the challenges, in terms of the 99% economy that Paul Adler will talk to us about in a few weeks. And the lobbyist point, Henry, what is your sentiment with lobbyists?
Well, the Supreme Court of the United States legalized bribery some years ago. It's called Citizens United. And what they did, literally, what they did was throw the door open to political donations from the wealthy. And the consequence is quite clear, and especially in the Republican Party, but also in the Democratic Party, is they buy the Congress people, they buy the senators, and it's overt now, and it's destroying American democracy. And how could people be so blind to these problems? So, if you want to start by rebalancing society, overturn Citizens United, because it's absolutely abhorrent. But the Supreme Court has constantly upped the ante on corporations as persons. If corporations are persons, persons are allowed to make political donations. Well, they're not. In Canada, no kind of persons is allowed to make political donations to their heart content. There's a limit. At the same time that the US was opening that door, Brazil was closing it. Not that, I don't know how Bolsonaro got in there, but they would close the door to political donations of that kind, unlimited political donations. Sometimes I wonder what's in the water in the United States, because some of these things are so evident, and I can't make the point. I can make it. Lots of people are looking and saying, Henry, I like what you're doing, but I can't publicly make the point. The Rebalancing Society book is starting to move, but it hasn't sold much, and it's resonating much more around the world than it is in the United States. And yet this is the origin of modern democracy, and yet it's being lost, and something is dumbing the country down. And
I think as you once suggested in the context of international litigations, the Europeans need to stand their ground. So I'm glad to take your message to Europe, but I think, Antoinette, you want to move into the first section. What is the good society? So can I hand the first question over to you, and hopefully we're warmed up now.
Yeah, I think it's almost a very moving passage, because you have already told us a lot, but I just maybe quickly want to ask you to wrap up, what's then the problem with corporations in that capitalism? So you called it corporate irresponsibility, which is a very nice term. And at the same time, why are we failing on regulations and nationalizations and everything the government can do? Because these are the two core factors why you say we need a third, we need the plural sector.
Wait, express it a bit differently, because
what is the problem then with the companies? Why can't we have these different objectives of capitalism? Why do they not work? So that's the first question.
okay, I mean, I'm not one for simplistic solutions, but I think there is one. The stock market is utterly dysfunctional. And we're really talking, we're not so much talking about entrepreneurial companies, at least until they go public. Entrepreneurial companies tend to be more responsible. They're not always. Some are very irresponsible. But some of them view their employees as almost family. They're deeply devoted to their products. They're personally humiliated if something goes wrong, and so on and so forth. It's the big corporations, and the big corporations, the stock, by that I mean the publicly traded corporations. And if you're constantly being driven to up shareholder value, not for 10 years or 20 years out, but for the next quarterly report, which is crazy that we're reporting massive corporations on a quarterly basis. But if you're constantly driven to do that, you've got to find ways to do it, and you can't necessarily find the ways that made you great in the first place. You know, what makes Amazon amazing and Google amazing and Apple amazing is not necessarily what they're doing now so much as what they did to get there. And they created new business models that serve us brilliantly. I mean, Apple, I can't do it without my phone now, and Amazon delivers, especially living in the country. I put an order Sunday and they're knocking on my door Monday in the country, 100 kilometers from Montreal. In the middle of nowhere, not the nowhere, but a small place. So they do amazing things. As they go public, and especially as the creative founders leave, as mostly many have done, then they get replaced by people who may be responsible or may not, but they've got to keep producing. When Apple was the first company to pass $1 billion in $1 trillion in share value, that was the starting point for the stock market. They didn't say, wow, you can rest now, Apple, you've done so well. No, what are you delivering tomorrow? We don't give a damn about the trillion you've developed to date. What are you doing next? And if they can't find what to do next the way they used to, because they're not entrepreneurial anymore that way, then the shenanigans begin. Not necessarily in those companies, although you can find it in those companies too. But the shenanigans begin, and you see these in some of the major American banks, some of the major pharmaceutical companies, where they're just doing things that are absolutely abhorrent, So
I mean, there would be like one natural solution. We always shout in that moments, we ask for better regulations. What about better regulations? Why do you believe these fail in these instances?
Because domestically, corporations tend to have a lot of influence in government, unless there happens to be a rather right-wing government. But, in one of the provinces in Canada, Alberta, which is the most right-wing province in the country, they elected quite a left-leaning leader. And she probably was one of the best premiers of any of the provinces we've had. But she couldn't touch the pipelines or the oil businesses because they depend on those. So liberal as she was, small L liberal, she's called New Democrat, small L liberal as she was, she couldn't touch the pipelines or the oil businesses. So, and globally, it's a race to the bottom on corporate taxation. It's a race to the bottom. Every country has to keep dropping its corporate taxes because every other country is dropping its corporate taxes. So corporations don't pay their share anymore. And if Canada decided to up it, Canada was one of the ones that went quite low, around 15%. If they decided to go back to 30%, the corporations would all claim to leave. Of course, it would be bluff in a lot of cases because Canadian banks aren't going to leave Canada, but other companies might. And so globalization, which is economic globalization, is incontestable. It has no countervailing power. Nobody can stand up. Even the big countries have trouble standing up to international globalization.
Can I ask a follow-up on that, Henry? Because so you said already fixing society is what we really need. And then you suggest the role of the plural sector. But I think your vision is, if I quote you, a respected government, responsible enterprise, and robust communities. That would be the outcome, so to speak. But aren't
and respected governments, yeah, respected governments, responsible enterprises, and robust communities, yeah.
So if that is if we are today living the opposite, is that not just a symptom of a common root cause that? And I'm looking a little bit at your book on healthcare management, where you suggest it is care over cure. Is there not a lack of caring that is at the basis of all of this? And therefore, we shouldn't only intervene in one part. It's actually at the basis, like you say, of society not caring enough.
Well, if you're driven enough, then you can't care. You know, it's relaxed people or comfortable people or particularly determined people who care. Like mothers more than fathers often, you know, and not that fathers necessarily bad, but mothers are much more devoted to their kids in a very tangible way. So we lose sight. This gets back to the good society, and you know, a good society cares. Good people care. Good parents care. Fathers too. Good countries care. And we're driving caring out in a way, but another dimension of that is we're losing the sense of a sort of an equilibrium in healthcare. We devote much more effort to cure than to cause. We're not geared to cause. It's tougher. The puzzles are tougher for cause. Even though the puzzle can be very tough for cure, but cure is more tangible. You know, they came out with a vaccine for the pandemic. Fantastic, fantastic. But who's looking at the cause of the pandemic? I don't mean the origin and with some bat in a Chinese market, but what's carrying the pandemic around? I go back to pollution because I think it's a factor. Who's looking at that? So we lose sight of what matters. Cause matters more than cure. Not that cure doesn't matter in healthcare, of course it matters, but cause is more important because if you can deal with cause, you don't need cure. You don't need to cure a disease if you can get to the cause. We know how to stop lung cancer. You know, it's more important to stop smoking than to have to treat people who have lung cancer. And what we're having now is it's more important to get the vaccination than to be treated in an ICU.
But isn't then Henry the root cause? And you write about this this atomistic individualism, and I think you even in terms of structures in your work on healthcare, you note that there is a fetish about differentiation, this fragmentation, and it's even in our society where it's the state or the public enterprise against the state, the individual against the state. And as you say, the role of the state is being constantly diminished by many of the actors. So is this lack of togetherness, right, as you write about communityship, is that not the root cause of everything?
It's a root cause. Individualism runs rampant in society. It's mind-blowing, the kind of things we tolerate. You know, in France and other countries too, but especially in France, if you're driving on a country road and somebody is flashing his lights, her lights, that's telling you that there's a police check coming up, okay? They don't know you from Adam, but they're taking great pride in squealing on the authorities, except they live there. And you might be drunk and kill that guy's wife the next day. They don't know who you are, but they're taking pride in warning you. It's individualism absolutely out of control. You know, now they have laws in France that if you flash your lights, they're going to ticket you. It's kind of one thing piled on top of the other. The French are very individualistic. They're also very communal in a funny kind of way. But individualism is you see it with the anti-vaxxers right now, right? They're crazy. they until they get the disease and are lying in an ICU, then they stop to be crazy. Look, if you want to jump off a bridge and kill yourself, it's your business. I'll try and stop you and talk you out of it, but it's your business. But if you're jumping off that bridge to land on me, it's my business. And if you don't take the vaccine, that's not your business. That's my business, because you can infect me or my family. And we don't understand those things. The vaccination, is starting to help us understand those things, but we're not, we're just something that's making us very stupid, frankly. Something that's making so many of us, frankly, I don't only mean anti-vaxxers at all. I mean people like, let me name names, okay? George Soros, Friedman in the op-ed New York Times, and people like that who are continuously writing articles about how America will still have to save the world. All they recognize is noble America, and there is noble America, no doubt about it, highlighted with the Marshall Plan that was incredibly farsighted and brilliant, okay? But to them, there's no nasty America. It never existed. Well, come on. America's been all over every country in the hemisphere and every country in the world when it was on this anti-communist rampage. So even people like Soros and Friedman, who should know better, another one is Albright, was a third one, also America the Great. It's like, hey, what about nasty America? I'm not saying one is greater than the other. I'm saying they both coexist. How can you make statements like this? It's mindless. It's absolutely mindless.
Yeah, I think here we can see very well why you come up with this rebalancing, because of course you kind of say clearly that we have to have the nasty and the good, and therefore we need a third leg to control in a certain way. But I'm wondering, there was somebody who I believe marched quite long in the same direction like you. That was Paul Adler. He also has written a lot about communities and collaborative communities, so professional bureaucracies. But he has kind of given up. I mean, he took the same analysis as you were conducting, but in his new book, he comes up with a radical solution. He says that is not going to work. Community might not be there at present to really have this correcting force, and he is now asking for democratic socialism. So I was just wondering, throwing that at you, what is your opinion with that? Is that maybe a solution, or do you think that's certainly not a solution, and why?
I haven't read the book, and I can't comment on that. I'd like to know what he means by democratic socialism, because if the population doesn't want to elect democratic socialists, where do we go? And I agree that community may not be the answer, but to me, it's the best answer I know. And I go back to two experiences, because if we want to look at the kind of radical change we're talking about, and I don't mean revolution, and I don't mean violence, but if we're talking about the kind of radical change I'm talking about, we have to find examples where that happened. And the two examples I think of particularly are the Reformation. The story of the Reformation in the 16th century is really interesting, because Luther was a nobody. He was a monk. He was a monk. He didn't have any particular authority or power or anything, but he nailed these theses on the door of a church. And what happened was, in today's terms, it literally went viral thanks to the new social medium. And the new social medium was the printing press. And his students took it off the wall, printed it up, and circulated it in towns all around, and it went viral to the point where it changed the church forever. That was a bottom-up, grounded community activity. Just as good example, or maybe even better, is the Quiet Revolution in Quebec, where Quebec had very, very strong Catholic Church up to 1960. And then the premier, who had been rather corrupt and rather part of this, died. And suddenly the whole population said, enough of this. And the women tell me stories about priests visiting the house and asking a woman who gave birth 2 months ago if she's pregnant again. Okay. And the women kind of said, the hell with that. So women of a certain generation all had 6, 8, 10, 12 babies. Women of the next generation all have 1, 2, rarely 3 babies. They just said, the hell with it. And Quebec went so far that it went totally anti-Catholic. It just, most people just rejected the church totally. That was ground up. That wasn't even led by anybody. It was a group of people saying, enough, you've had enough. So why can't that happen? That's what I mean by community. And when will people say, we've had enough? This is your role too, in helping this message get out.
Which will be interesting, right? Because even...
two things here. First of all, if I just try to analyze that, we have to have this luring, inspiring manifesto, which is print, maybe not at the church, but all over. And we have to have a lot of local initiatives that really then come up and produce this other view, this community. But I'm wondering...
Let me just say, because I get thoughts as you're going along, so I want to just react to that. We have more social initiatives now than ever in history, and the situation is getting worse. What we need is the consolidation of social initiatives. To me, the consolidation is around recognition that most of this relates to imbalance, okay? And as far as a manifesto is concerned, you might want to get into this later, but in this house, we had a meeting point on all of this that turned this around with 9 people right here, right near where I'm sitting. And one of the guys who was there, an American guy, we were Americans, Canadians, a Dane, somebody from Iran, and one of the guys kept saying, one of the American guys kept saying, we need to look at the Declaration of Independence. He kept saying, we need to look at the Declaration of Independence. So on the way home, we were driving in the car, I was driving, and one of the guys, another American, was sitting in the back, and he brought up the American Declaration of Independence, and we started to rewrite it in the car, okay? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all people are created dependent on each other, our earth, and its climate, okay? And it goes on like that. So we did that as a kind of manifesto, as a statement to bring people, to consolidate people's efforts. And that's available. Anybody can sign it. It's on rebalancingsociety.org, or you can go to declarationofinterdependence.org.
Let me bring it up whilst we're on it, because this was one of the few artifacts that we've got for our listeners. Here you go. And our interdependence.org. But you can take a screenshot if you want in the meantime. Is there anything else that you want to point out from this, Henry?
No, we just need a clear statement, the way the Americans needed a clear statement in 1776. And why not a bit of a play on that statement? I mean, there are only 3 or 4 sentences that actually relate closely to that declaration, but this one, the one I read in particular a moment ago, we tried to make a case for balance in a generic way.
Very interesting, and I love the initiative. And when we first saw it, we thought that was probably the most brilliant idea that we had for a long, long time in this space. And by the way, Bill Torbett, to whom we spoke yesterday, sends you his warm regards, and he was also hoping to get some focus on action in this call. And he suggested a very similar thing. He says, we need interdependence. We need people who independently come together as adults and declare to each other what they owe each other as adults in a collectively responsible system. And I think that's a very similar thought to yours.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's obvious, isn't it, really? I mean, it's obvious. And yet, look, what you're doing is, for me, amazing, because you're pulling together so much of what I've done. I've never seen that before, honestly, although there are people who know my work, but I've never seen it quite pulled together before. But it's been out there for years. Why did it take so long? And,
I think we have some views, Henry, because I want to ask one more question in this section, and we go to management. But I think what we have encountered is, like you said, there's a lot of individualism, but even more so, I would argue, in those people who have good ideas. Many of them are prima donnas who, as Antoinette and I will attest, are not entirely willing. They might go into dialogue, but very seldom are they willing to build on each other's. They all have similar concepts, but with different names, publications behind that, status behind that, rankings behind that, and that people would actually come together and say, let's all sit around the same table as you just suggested and build something that we can all stand behind. I haven't seen happening anywhere.
Yeah, my second book is subtitled "A Synthesis of the Research," and I've done a lot of that. The famous expression that physical scientists stand on the shoulders of each other and social scientists stand on their faces, and there are good ideas out there. There are a lot of bad ideas out there, but there are good ideas, and we can build on the best, of course.
Well, I think what comes to mind is you suggested once we need to bring economics back to where it belongs, which is within the social sciences, and let's forget about this Nobel Prize, which is not a Nobel Prize for economics, but I think we will get there in a second. But I want to ask you one more question on the good society, if I may, which is property. Because you have written about the role of property in the commons. And we had a conversation briefly with Luigino Bruno, who was suggesting that one of the key things is that we need to learn again to own the commons without owning the property. And that is a thought which I see very clearly reflected in your work. What's your thinking on commons and property?
Well, that's why Rebalancing Society is out as a PDF, because I asked the publisher, a wonderful Barrett Kohler, wonderful publisher, really concerned with these kinds of issues. And I said, for this one book, can we make it available to anybody as a PDF so people who can't afford it can have it? And that's why it's available. It's available as a book. It's available as an ebook and a print book, but it's also available that way. The forms of property go with the three sectors, because we have private property in the private sector, and we have public property in the public sector, and we have common property in the plural sector, like Wikipedia, like open source software, and so on. It was a brilliant idea, something like Wikipedia. And the idea of making things available to people to build on them, to put a platform out there and don't charge for it necessarily, although I'm not against people trying to make money if they create something, but in this case where it's got so much social benefit, that's why, my book on structuring is not available for free necessarily, but my book on Rebalancing Society is, because it's a major social issue that I'm trying to address.
Very good. And I think the linkage with intellectual property, as you describe in some of your books, is very interesting. But I think at this point, I want to move to the second aspect, which is organizations. And is there a linkage between morality, ethics, the good society, and how we should build organizations? Because I think what you say is we need a much stronger plural sector, but we need responsible organizations. And of course, that is something Antoinette and I are especially interested in. The quote to kick us off, which I really liked, was, organizations are communities of human beings, not collections of human resources. Mm-hmm. And starting us off, maybe, Henry, if you could go back to your thinking on the structure of organizations, in that 1979 first edition book, which you're revising, you had, I believe, 6 archetypes, from entrepreneurial, machine, diversified, professional, and then autocracy, and in later editions, innovative and missionary. Where's your thinking now on structure? And which is, if any, a structure that would support your thinking on the Rebalancing Society?
Well, two separate issues. I'm sticking roughly with the outline of that book, but making it much clearer, much better examples, more elaborate, not longer, shorter, but taking the time to write a shorter letter, right? But more consolidated. I've changed the names a little bit, so I'll call it a program machine, a professional assembly, because it's just an assembly of people, a project prospector, and a personal enterprise. It's the same four. The divisionalized one I'm treating as federation in the book, but a little separately. But there's much more on hybrids and mixtures and combinations and playing Lego, in the sense of not putting together pieces like a jigsaw puzzle, but building unusual structures with a bunch of Lego pieces. So it's kind of like that. Now, how does it relate? Certainly discussion of the missionary organization, which I'm calling the community ship. I like community ship as a concept, but I call the missionary organization a community ship, in the sense that it's a ship apart that sends things out or takes things back, but keeps independent from other organizations. So these are like religious sects and highly highly driven kinds of organizations. So I'm trying to keep those. I'm discussing all that, and that needs to play a role clearly. But I'm also discussing a whole new chapter in the book on what I call organizations outward bound, which is this whole trend now to open the borders of organizations by creating a platform like Wikipedia, for example, in common property, that is a platform for anybody to come in. So I'm a part of Wikipedia. I don't pay, I actually donate, but I don't pay for Wikipedia. I'm not charged as a member, and I'm not officially a member, but nobody's officially a member. But I can enter Wikipedia and change the entry on you. I could say that you're a miserable person or a wonderful person. Or I'm not sure I'd get away with it for very long, but I can write what I like. So we're all part of Wikipedia, and that's important, and that's part of that. In effect, a lot of organizations are becoming project organizations, in the sense that what Wikipedia does, it creates the platform. That's the project. And then people come in and read the entries or change the entries. So there's a lot of that going on. The boundaries are breaking down, which means an entry into the sense of community too. If organizations are less isolated than they were, and more open, their boundaries are more open, then we need to think the same thing about societies.
But is there, Henry, I think you're writing at the very basic, organization is about differentiation and integration. And I think you're saying sometimes differentiation is reified. I still wonder, we need more integration. And Mary Parker Follett clearly said that 100 years ago and more.
Right.
But if that is not there, are there any structures that could help people to get the environment where they go towards that community? If that is not, or is that just norms and not structures? Is it processes, procedures versus organizational forms? What's your thinking? Is there something, even for corporates? I mean, not so much plural sector.
Well, societies comprise organizations. They're made up of organizations. And so they can't separate the two. In fact, one of the main problems with corporate social responsibility is this idea that organizations are isolated and they feed their owners above all else. They're social instruments. They have no right to exist if they're not social instruments. If they stopped supplying product, nobody would tolerate them. Well, if they're behaving irresponsibly, nobody should tolerate them. They exist under national charters. They're given the permission to exist. And it used to be that governments could take away that permission in certain cases. That's gone, long gone. Nobody can close down an organization because it's irresponsible. But we certainly need stronger public activities to do that. Now I've lost track of your question.
No, but I think one of our inquiries was on structure. Are there structures which are more conducive to this community ship than others? And we're looking at sociocracy and holacracy and Hayek's new model for internal markets, etc. But I think Antoinette is probably get us into practices more than structures, which might be the more important aspect here.
I wanted to do actually both.
Let me
Exactly,
just-
Henry. I hear that because in your articles you are drilling down.
Antonio, let me just respond to that quickly.
Of course.
Machine organizations are much tighter, much more closed, and really want to be closed. They want to keep everything out as much as they can so they can do no surprises. Machine organizations don't like surprises. Adhocracies live with surprises all the time. And so they're much more open. So a lot of these new forms that you're mentioning are kind of adhocracies or project organizations. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess that is exactly where I wanted to go, because in earlier writings you made it rather clear, and especially if we look at the topic and also responsibility, that it's very difficult for managers to act in a responsible fashion, to act in an ethical fashion if they are in a machine bureaucracy or in a divisionalized form. And that probably is still quite problematic because most big companies are still, I mean, is this still, are you still in agreement with what you wrote there? And maybe you can explain that to us, why it's more difficult?
Yeah, I'm not sure I've changed on that. I think the machine form, other than the entrepreneurial form, because there's so many little enterprises and corner stores, and so it's huge numbers. But our mentality is machine-like, mostly. And that means, consultants come in and it's get more order and tighten your systems and, clamp down on people breaking the rules and all that stuff. So that really is still dominant, I think. But it does, I think a lot of contemporary organizations are project organizations, like Wikipedia, like a lot of creative consulting firms, like research labs, like a lot of international bodies that deal with problems as they come up.
But I want to, one more thing on structure, Henry, because I find healthcare very interesting because, I mean, you've done a lot of research in healthcare. I think it's no surprise that Amy Edmondson, when she was starting to talk about psychological safety, had done a lot of research in healthcare. And actually in Paul Adler's book, The 99% Economy, he is taking Kaiser Permanente as one of the examples of collaborative enterprises. And it's a healthcare provider, again, that could provide some insight. So I wonder, from your work on healthcare and your book on, I got it here, Managing the Myths of Healthcare, are there any lessons that would also apply to organizations outside that sector?
Well, they're archetypical professional assemblies in a way, and their problems are ones that could be applied. So the part of that book maybe I like best is that the job of a hospital and medicine in general is to get me into their categories. So I got a problem in my lower right abdomen, good. We diagnose it, it's appendicitis, we take out the appendix, everybody's happy. That's the great strength of medicine. And it's phenomenal. It's phenomenal. I mean, I had an operation where my heart was on the table. I mean, literally, for a while until they put it back. I mean, it's amazing. But it's also the debilitating weakness of medicine. It's the great strength of medicine, and it's the debilitating weakness because, for three reasons. If you don't fit the categories, what's called IBS, irritable bowel syndrome, which they don't know anything about, from what I understand, you're in trouble. Forget medicine. It won't help you. And they don't attend to it. Or if you cut across illnesses, what do you call it? Older patients, not pediatric, what do you call it? Elderly people present often
chronic illnesses, you said, and immune system problems.
Yeah. It's my elderliness that caused me to forget. But geriatric patients will present with various problems, and they're not very good at cooperating with each other. So if it needs different medical specialties to deal with it, that's not easy. The third one is more interesting still, and maybe this says a lot for other organizations, which I call beneath. So the first is outside the categories, then across the categories, but there's beneath the categories, that the treatment you need is better than what the protocols call for. And there's a wonderful article discussed in the book called The Bell Curve, in which somebody was phenomenal in his own field because he went deeper. He looked at, he treated the person and not just the patient. He went beyond the symptoms. He went into the person's life to find out why she wasn't doing the exercises, what could help her do the exercises, and so on. And that's why he was so successful. I think that idea of probing deeper is important. And the other message in that book, which I don't get into deeply enough, but I do in some later writing we're talking about doing, is I call it the case for cause, which we already talked about, that healthcare has to look much more at cause than it does now. Cure is fine, cause is better.
I just found, and back to you, Antoinette, I just found the framing that you had with care versus cure, control versus community. I think those are very interesting dimensions for this puzzle. But Antoinette, back to you.
I hope I'm not completely out of the flow, because I just wanted to drill a little bit more down on the problematic aspects of organizations. And you are such a controversial thinker that you've come up with quite a number. And I just wanted to throw some at you, which are at present in current bestsellers, how we have to restructure our companies. And I'm just curious what you say about them. First of all, I still read CEO superstar pay. What's your insight on that? Good or bad?
An abomination. An absolute abomination. The effective companies are run as communities. The exception is entrepreneurial firms where Steve Jobs was a genius, so forget all the rest. He was a genius. But effective companies, aside from people like that, effective companies are communities of people. They work together, they cooperate, they function together. The idea that a CEO should accept to be paid 300 times as much as the workers in the company makes that person not a leader. If you want a definition of someone who's not a leader, it's somebody who by his pay is prepared to send the message that I'm 300 times more important than any of my workers. That's an abomination. Those people have more money than they can ever spend. It's all a big game of whose mine is bigger than yours, but that doesn't build big, good companies. That builds portfolios, so when they retire and leave the mess behind, somebody else can deal with it.
Well, we couldn't have wished for a more passionate plaidoyer. Let me give you another one. The smartest guy is always outside the company. That's why we need to get these very expensive CEOs from outside.
That's nonsense too. I mean, it's not nonsense. Sure, it's sometimes true. The smartest guy doesn't say much about the company if they don't have anybody that's smart. You mean to say that this is an absolute prescription that the company can't possibly produce anybody who's smart? And therefore you have to find people outside? That's a terrible condemnation of a company and of its previous leadership. Look, sometimes you need to bring in somebody from the outside, but bring in someone who knows the culture and can render changes in it without throwing away the cultural baby with the market bathwater is important. So I don't buy those simplifications. I can find examples to the contrary.
Another one which I still hear very often is internal competition is inspiring. Let's, for instance, work with internal rankings. We need it. Internal competition. What?
You know, I just wrote a little bit about that. We're collaborative and we're cooperative. We're collaborative and we're competitive, and we all are. And too much collaboration is dysfunctional because you can't break away from what you're doing. Too much competition is dysfunctional. So you need some competition, but you need collaboration the same way. You know, my comment about economists who say there's no such a thing as generosity is, what kind of mother did you have? You know,
And I think on this one, Henry, you once wrote, and Antoinette, I think this is interesting, there is no we in standard economic dogma. And I think, Henry, you were referring to the famous Keynes quote that in the long run, we're all dead. But that was we as an individual. And you said there's no collective we. I think that's a very interesting statement.
When what's his name in England, what's his name? The Keynes, when Keynes said in the long run, we're all dead, which everybody laughed and loved, he didn't mean we as a society. He never would have supported we being all dead. He meant each of us. He didn't mean all of us. And that's typical of economics, which is overemphasis on the individual and complete ignoring, for the most part, rather ignoring of collective needs. That's why you mentioned at the very beginning that we need both. We need individualism, we need collectivism, we need communalism, and we need to find some kind of balance across those things.
Well, what about, you already started with that, the stock market?
Well, I suspect if we close them down, it might not be a bad thing. But we can certainly, and it's one of those outrageous comments that's probably true. But we can certainly fix them. We can certainly get rid of short-term things. We can get rid of this idea that the CEO is the company. We can get rid of this enormous pressure from kids who got an MBA and are earning $1 million a year, looking over the shoulders of people who know what they're doing and are just dysfunctional because of it. They're destroying enterprises by this kind of pressure.
But I think there's in Colin Mayer's book on prosperity, I think Colin is trying to show 7 or 8 stages of evolution of the economy. And the last one he suggests, similar to your point, is financialization. And he said what we actually have is an inversion of the principal agent problem. Before, we were all centered in corporate governance, being centered on making sure that the agents wouldn't do something that the principals didn't want because they were caring about the enterprise. Today, to a degree, the principals are just some anonymous people on the stock market who have no interest in the going concern or the understand the organizations. And you have the opposite problem, right? So I think it's a very interesting, the financialization, which coincides roughly with your kind of collapse of the Berlin Wall, so to speak, is interesting, right? So the financialization role of financial services might be quite important in this.
What kind of a society do you have when day traders own the company and 30-year employees have no say in the governance of the company? What kind of society do you have? It's a society where day traders own the company for a few minutes. It's nuts. It's absolutely nuts. It's another one of these things that creeps up on us. It's totally illogical, but try and convince anybody to even entertain the thought, and they think you're a nut. People sometimes call me a contrarian. None of this is contrarian. Nothing I said is contrarian. It's all argued based on a certain logic. What people call contrarian are ideas that they can't fathom, because they're so imbibed, they've been weaned on such narrow ideas, they can't see past them.
I hear a last topic which we might want to cover here, because of course in the end that is also related to corporate governance. And you have written that boards ever so often do not function. How would we have to change the boards? What are your ideas in order to have a more responsible corporate governance?
Yeah, well, for starters, I'm not a big fan of boards. It's a status position. They don't necessarily understand the company in much depth, or the NGO for that matter. Although they'll interfere in an NGO a lot quicker than they'll interfere in the company. So when there's close held or somebody owns the place, or there's more intense ownership, but it doesn't come just from me to say the boards need to be opened up. there are various constituencies. In Germany, Germany's an amazing, I mean, you're living there. Germany, you're not, but you're near the border. But Germany is an amazing company. I mean, you yourself in Switzerland, but Germany is an amazing country in the sense that the workers have half the seats on the governing boards, and yet the country has done so phenomenally well despite enormous wage rates. I mean, Germany is hugely successful economically, and doesn't need that other kind of corporate governance.
Although I have to tell you that the wage rates, and especially the lower wages in Germany, are really lumping very strongly behind. And I think you have analyzed somewhere that unfortunately, although you have that representation, they often do not really take the workers' position. But I do agree with you. It's a first good idea, but probably not yet enough.
Yeah, I think there's some interesting investigation to be done. I want to
let me just give you another example of when I was in Copenhagen, where, by the way, if you're talking about governance, the interesting example in Denmark, I think in Scandinavia largely, but in Denmark and in India with Tata, that these companies, well-known ones like Carlsberg, Lego, issue shares on the stock market, but they're controlled by trusts, often family trusts, but trusts. So it enables them to tell the stock market, you're not calling the shots. You can earn from our profits, but you're not calling the shots. And those are very successful, sustainable companies. So you don't need the traditional boards and ownership to be successful in a big corporation.
But it's very interesting, and I think we will continue to investigate here. We had a chat with Stefano Zamagni, who has been researching into cooperatives, especially in Europe, in Italy, in Germany, and in the UK. And I think there's an interesting question about corporations. We will talk to Bruno Frey about monasteries and some of the learnings that we can get from such structures, because I think some argue they are the longest going corporations for 700-800 years since very early Middle Ages. So I think, and a good friend of us, Graham, help me, Antoinette. What's his last name?
Graham Boyd.
Graham Boyd has written a book on Rebuild, where he is arguing for new forms of legal structures, because he's suggesting the current structures are not enough. We need something that enshrines the accountability for the commons in the very articles of the organization. I think all these are interesting ideas, and maybe to your earlier point on structure, there's probably place for a heterogeneous, so to speak, and different forms and different shapes, as long as there's a fundamental contract in society to rebalance. What I want to do is move us into the I think you called it in one of your earlier works, the pièce de résistance, the main part of our banquet tonight, which is how do we get from where we are to where we want to be? What you've also called the Irene question. But before going there, I want to just briefly pause and maybe, Antoinette, just throw up some of the key insights that we've gotten until now, also for our listeners, because we've covered a lot of ground, and then move into the last 20 minutes to get Henry's views on the journey from here. So we've started to talk about good society, and we looked at how can organizations become better in terms of structures and processes and procedures, so to speak, or functions within. Do you want to kick us off, Antoinette? What are the 3 or 4 thoughts that you are taking away? And then Henry can build on that and highlight anything we've forgotten.
Well, to me, it was enlightening that balance is not only checks and balances, how I first understood it when I read your book, but it's also balancing between polarities. So you're very mindful that there is competition and collaboration, for instance, and that we need the private sector and the plural sector because they have different logics as well. So this is something I take away and find this for me a very important finding, because I didn't see that before. And the second thing is, I think it's also interesting that you are very clear on a few specific factors which we really have to think about. I mean, if I would say we need a regulation at all, then I would say maybe we should make sure that we don't have these type of outrageous pay. So maybe that's the only thing we should have done after the financial crisis, that we went after something like that. And I hear you also with the stock market. And in fact, I believe at present it's so easy to get capital differently that we also see a number of companies really retreating from the stock market. So that's interesting. So these are just two things which, of the many things we discussed, really stood out for me.
Yeah, yeah. You know, I did a table I did the book, which you mentioned, but I also did a website, which I guess you're going to talk about, called rebalancingsociety.org. And in there is a table. The Irene question is, Irene is a manager who's worked in the private and plural sectors, who read an early draft of my book and said, what can I do? And ever since then, I've always been plagued by everybody saying, yeah, but what can I do? What can I do? So finally, I kind of bit the bullet, and I developed this table with 15 different dots, where you click on a dot and you can find out what you can do as an individual, in a community, in a company, in a government, and so on, either to reframe your own thoughts, or to renew what's wrong, or replace what's wrong, or renew what's right, and so on. So, and to me, this came together, this whole website came together like a puzzle, not a jigsaw puzzle where you have pieces that are given and they've all fit together and make the image. I didn't know what image I was trying to make. I didn't know what the pieces were. I knew they wouldn't fit neatly together. But as I did that website, I basically constructed this sort of solution to this rebalancing puzzle. And that's what I think makes this kind of particularly consequential, I think.
And why don't we go there? So thanks, Antoinette, for the wrap on the first two parts. So how do we get there? And I want to throw in, Henry, a few of your concepts, and then show the page that you've got on the website as one kind of frame for your thoughts on Rebalancing Society. But before we go there, I want to touch briefly on leadership, because I know you have some thoughts on the value of leadership. I think we want to touch again, just because it's, I think, been a long time, and we really enjoyed it, the notion of strategy and emergence versus planning in the context of changing society. And then I think we want to slowly make our way to that question, can capitalism be saved and how? And then we will go to the website. But I want to start us off with leadership. And I will quote from your book on healthcare, because I really enjoyed it. You have a page, it's on page 193, the rules for being a heroic leader. So for all the people out there who want to become a heroic leader, one, look out, not in. Be dramatic. For senior positions, choose outsiders over insiders. Emphasize the numbers. Change everything all the time. And I think somewhere else you said, if in doubt, reorganize. That's always good. Above all, get the performance numbers up, no matter how temporarily. So on that notion, Henry, do you want to share with us your highly positive and appreciative thoughts on the concept of leadership over management?
Well, I never said it quite this way before, but I'm not a big fan of mommy and daddy leadership. You know, where's mommy and where's daddy? I think leadership's important, but the trouble with the word leadership is it implies an individual. When you say leader, you don't mean a group, you don't mean a community, don't mean several people, you mean someone. And it's hyper individualistic. And what we need is communityship more than leadership. Leadership to me is also an intrinsic part of management. They're not separate. In order to manage, you have to lead. In order to lead, you have to manage. Managers who don't lead are boring, and leaders who don't manage don't know what's going on. So those two things are intricately tied together, but we need to get to communityship. We need to get to this idea that organizations are great because people are truly pulling together. And by paying somebody 300 times as much as the workers, you're not sending that message at all. You're sending the opposite message. You're depreciating the whole company.
And I have a few quotes that I want to throw in before, Antoinette, I will hand over to you, which I really enjoyed in this context. So you're writing, the more we obsess about leadership, the less of it we seem to be getting, which I think is very insightful. And then you say, empowerment is what managers do to people, whereas engagement is what managers do with people. And in this context, again, you say between individual leadership and collective citizenship is this concept of collaborative communityship. So maybe just before going into some of the next questions, in a simple way, how would you describe communityship?
Communityship means that people are members, people are respected, the organization respects them, and so they respect the organization. It's collaborative. So we need another ship word besides ownership and citizenship and leadership and everything else, which is communityship, that effective organizations work as communities. The empowerment, isn't it a joke that empowerment, you're hired into a job and then you have to be empowered to do it? I mean, that's silly. If you're hired into a job, physicians don't need to be empowered to work in hospitals. Why should workers have to be empowered to work in companies? Because they're mistreated or badly treated, or their jobs are so awful. So we need to, we need less. We don't not need leadership. We need less leadership, and we certainly need less emphasis on leadership. It's almost in the United States, almost an illness. Everybody's constantly talking about leadership and constantly pitching leadership, and we need to wake up to its limitations.
So I hear a lot of things. I still try to wrap it up to then ask you how you develop these type of managers. But I heard clearly communityship, engaging, collaborative, probably also distributed as one part. And the other part is, which you also had from the beginning, it's much more about the practice. It's knowledge and action interwoven. And that is also why you, I think, were quite frustrated with the current programs where we kind of teach leaders. And maybe you can bring us from there to your own management development, which you now have, you have 4 different development ideas in there, 4 different layers. And that's really interesting. Maybe you can walk us through.
Yeah. Years ago, I used to go around giving talks about what's wrong with MBA programs. And finally, people started to say, well, what are you doing about it? I used to say, I'm an academic. I'm not supposed to do anything about anything. I'm only supposed to complain. But I maintain that MBAs train the wrong people in the wrong ways with the wrong consequences. The wrong people because the assumption at the beginning is they're going to create managers or leaders. Nobody's ever created a leader in a classroom. Nobody's ever created a manager in a classroom, just like nobody's ever created a swimmer in a classroom. You learn to swim in the water, and managers learn to swim by being managers, and then they can be developed. And so we need much more kind of involvement and learning from experience. To learn management, forget learning leadership. Nobody learns leadership. I remember once the start of an MBA class, one of my colleagues, one of the rah-rah marketing guys said, who's a leader in this class? And about 5 hands went up. And I thought, they're not leaders. Leaders don't designate themselves. Leaders are designated by other people who want to follow them. So the key is to start with managers, start with people who understand management. And then you can emphasize not the science of management, of which there's little, but the art of management, and particularly the craft of management. Management's about experience. So we sit experienced managers in a healthcare and a business program at round tables, about 4, 5, 6 people around the table, and they share their experience. They reflect on their experience and they share it and they learn from each other. Half the time they're doing that. So if I talk about an emergent strategy in a lecture, then it's over to the tables. What can you do with this? Have you seen this? Is it feasible? Should you do more of it? How should you deal with it in your company? And the organization we created called Coaching Ourselves does the same thing within the company. So a group of people in the company can read some input on emergent strategy, namely strategy as learning, not as planning, and then discuss, how could we use this more? How do we get away from so much strategic planning, which is usually so absolutely useless, and do more strategic learning?
And on this one, Henry, and because this has been how we encountered you first in all our undergrad classes, right? And in your blog, in the wonderful book you wrote, Bedtime Stories for Managers, I think you're picking the story up under the title, Strategies Grow Like Weeds in a Garden. They are not cultivated like tomatoes in a hothouse. But one thing that I want to throw in there, which I think might be more subtle, you also say it's synthesis, not analysis. What exactly do you mean?
Well, if you read Michael Porter, it's all about doing competitive analysis. He calls it analysis.
I knew you would bring him up at some stage.
Well, he says, what is it? I favor companies. I forget. He's got a quote about how you make strategy through analysis. But strategy is integration. Strategy is synthesis. It's not analysis. You don't find synthesis in Porter. You find all kinds of useful analytical things to do, but it stops there. And the important thing is synthesis. And synthesis doesn't come from analysis. It comes from creative interaction and creative thinking. Entrepreneurs are brilliant at synthesizing. Look what Steve Jobs did with the laptop originally, and then with the iPad and with the iPhone and so on. These are enormous processes of synthesis. There's no technique for getting there. And you share it with people and you discuss, and in the conversation you build. That's how you develop good strategies, not by sitting in a retreat a million miles away from what the subject is. You know, you learn strategies in retailing by walking through your stores, by buying in your stores and finding out how it works and finding out what's missing and saying, hey, why can't we be doing that? You know, my favorite story of IKEA, why it got into unassembled furniture, because a worker tried to put a table in his car and he didn't fit, so he put the legs off, took the legs off. And then came the strategic moment, and it had nothing to do with the senior management. If we have to take the legs off, so do our customers. And that changed IKEA, and it changed the furniture business.
It's wonderful, and I have to say we rarely learn synthesis at all in university. I have to admit, it's mainly about analysis. Maybe as a last point here, why does it take such a long time for business schools to embrace more of these concepts? Because I think it's the same as with the other things we have been discussing. It's around for a longer time. I mean, Chris Archer is already started that journey, and we're still kind of doing the old stuff in teaching, in research. Any ideas? How can we reform our own institution we're working in?
Okay, so Antoinette, what proportion of your teachers in management are teaching analysis? And don't forget that business schools are very democratic institutions. So if 3/4 of the faculty is teaching analysis, how are you going to get synthesis? Okay, that's one thing. The other thing is success. They're minting money by mistreating education. They're minting money by sending people out who don't have a clue what real management is about, and are distorted from finding out. So few studies we have of MBAs as CEOs, including Harvard MBAs as CEOs, is they do worse and get paid more.
Okay.
Wonderful outlook, which I think gets us into the Irene question. I will bring up the slide, Henry, that is on your Rebalancing Society website, and we have probably 5-6 minutes, and then we have a small quiz to lead us out. But if you want to just explain what your thinking is behind that scheme, and maybe then just point out a few things that you have in mind where everybody could start. I think the last chapter in your book is I, me, and we. No, that can't be right. We, I, and us, I think. But by all means, we all have to help. So let me bring up the slide. And then let's take it from there. And again, everybody, you can see this slide on rebalancingsociety.org and find all the backup materials. So what's the thinking behind this, Henry?
That's not the one I meant. The one I meant is, if you can find it, is under acting on that website.
Okay.
If you go to acting and click on acting, and then you'll see the table at the bottom.
We are adaptive in our strategy. Let me bring it up real time.
You
so
also
here's,
have
here's the website.
Yeah, so click on acting.
Here you go.
And scroll down and let it form. Okay, that's what I'm talking about. Okay, so after the Irene question, getting harassed by so many people, including my own partner, who kept saying, yeah, but what can we do? Yeah, but what can we do? No matter what I said, it was, yeah, but what can we do? I started collecting everything we could possibly do. And I put them all into this table. So what can I do as a person? What can I do in my community? What can I do in my company? What can I do in my government? What can I do globally? And so on. And you can reframe, you can reverse what's wrong, you can renew what's right. Can you click? Will it work? If you click, I click on that. How do I reframe my beliefs? Okay, we can start by viewing myself as a resourceful human, not a human resource. Okay, we can consider why not before asking why. In other words, open our minds. So then you could go to, I don't know, go to plural sector renewing, the green one on the right. Let's just try that and see what comes. Yeah, grow the social economy. In other words, it's a collection of what a lot of people have talked about, but I don't think they've ever been pulled into one place. So there's a link. Anything orange is a link. So there's a link to the social economy, something I've written or something that's on Wikipedia, whatever. So can tell people what those things are. And it gives you a whole collection. There's about 35 or 40 things in this table. So I'm very proud of this. I also love the technology. I didn't do it, but
it's certainly interactive for people to, and it reminds me of maybe the final question on this one, Henry. It reminds me of a table that I received from some people very passionate about SDGs. And there was like a list behind the SDGs of what individuals could do. What's your view on SDGs?
Well, sorry, SUG.
No, SDGs. So they're Sustainable Development Goals.
About the millennial goals of the UN goal. What are my views on them?
Yeah, is that a strategy that we should embrace?
I think it's important. I think it's necessary, but wishes aren't going to get us anywhere. So isn't it a joke that what we have now? You know what the main reaction to climate change on the part of governments are? They make decade-long plans. They make 20, 30, 40-year plans. These are 4-year governments. They won't even be in power in 4 years, most of them. So Obama made a plan. Isn't that wonderful? Along comes Trump and the plan's in the garbage. So wishes, we don't need wishes, we need action.
And I think it starts with
actions.
And it starts with being a community, I think, is one of the loudest and clearest messages I'm taking from this. And this brings us to the end of the wonderful discussion, Henry. And again, many, many thanks for taking the time. We have a little quiz to close us out. And so the idea is like a 1-minute quiz where we will give you some pointers for you just to comment on. And yeah, there are, I think, 4 or 5 subjects, whatever comes to your mind. And the first one is leadership or management. I think you've answered this one.
Leadership and management.
and manage. Care or cure?
Cause.
Very good. What is the biggest problem in society today? A lack of love, a concentration of power, abandonment of faith, or Nobel Prizes in economics, or none of the above?
Wait, go through this again. My head can
Lack of love, concentration of power, abandonment of faith, or Nobel Prizes in economics?
Well, I give power first, not that I don't want to include economics, but I give power first. And economics, by the way, has too much power. We're doing a kind of humorous piece on sports and so on. And one of our questions is, how come in tennis, love, it doesn't count for anything?
A very, very good question.
You know what I mean by love? 30 love, 40 love.
Love, yes.
Love doesn't count for anything. Love's a big zero.
It's a zero. I think it's a very, very good question.
Lack of love. No, there's lots of love in the world, actually. Just not enough in the right places.
That's very good. Micromanagement or macro leading?
Neither. Because macro leading is disconnected and micro managing is obviously bad, but knowing what's going on is not micromanaging. Going into the operations and asking questions about what's going on is not micromanaging, it's informing.
Very good, which is, I think, resonant with your point that managers is one of the most important roles in society. Efficiency or economy?
I think effectiveness. Efficiency, it turns out, we have a nice little piece on that on my blog and also in the bedtime stories, but efficiency, it turns out to mean measurable efficiency. When I say to someone a restaurant is efficient, they immediately think of speed of service. Why don't they think of quality of food? Because speed of service is more measurable. And so efficiency comes down to what you can measure and excluding what you can't. You can't measure love. You can't measure communityship very easily, but you can measure profit.
Which the next one would have been, you can measure, you can manage what you can measure, but I think I've got my answer on that. Karl Marx, Pope Francis, Friedrich Hayek, Angela Merkel, or Kofi Annan?
Oh, who do I like
Who
best?
who would you choose?
Who would I what?
Who would you choose?
Wait, let's start at the beginning.
Karl Marx, Pope Francis, Friedrich Hayek, Angela Merkel, or Kofi Annan?
I think Kofi Annan was a good manager, but I wouldn't choose him. To drive or help reformation, ironically, I think the Pope could play a major role because he's listened to, he's a global voice, he seems to care. Aside from that, Merkel. I think Merkel has been a brilliant leader, manager, and has done extremely well and is a model, I think, to good government.
Wonderful. And I think my very last question, and this is very, very contentious. I'm sure you will not have an easy answer on this one. Aix-en-Provence or Montreal?
Lac Castor. Lac Castor and the Queyras.
Oh.
Okay. Lac Castor is where we have, it's not the name of a town, but it's where we have our house on the lake. The lake is called Lac Castor. And the Queyras is the most delightful part of France, about 3-hour drive from Aix-en-Provence, where I've lived. Yeah.
Wonderful. And I think, Henry, with that, we're going to close. Is there one thing you would ask anyone who is listening to do or take away from this session before we close finally?
Do. It's up to you, everybody. It's what you do. It's not what you think. It's not what you care about. It's not what you complain about. It's what you do to affect some kind of restoration of balance.
Henry, I can only say it has been a sublime pleasure. We had a few chats with you already, and every single time we've gone away with some learning and some insights. And I think, Antoinette, that's the same we had today. So I can only say a very, very big thanks on our behalf. Antoinette, any final word from you?
The same. It was a pleasure. Very informative, very much learnings.
So thank you too. I frankly have never encountered anybody ever, including my own doctoral students, who know my work better. It's absolutely amazing. It really is amazing. You've just pulled everything out. It's really good.
And it was certainly a pleasure. Henry, with that,
convey that to somehow to convey to other people, sort of, I mean, you're doing it through this, obviously, but otherwise, yeah.
Thank you so much. It's been a marvelous pleasure.
Thank you. You guys are amazing.